Before we jump into John's podcast, if you've ever felt like you should be reading more or thinking more deeply about the world, but didn't know where to start or who to do it with, we just launched something for you. It's an online book club and community with Dr. John Patrick. Starting this February, we'll go through important books together, guided by Dr. John, with live discussions and a thoughtful group of people who want to grow in wisdom, clarity, and critical thinking. It's free to join right now, but we may introduce paid access later. A benefit, if you do join now, you'll get exclusive early access to a live Q&A with Dr. Patrick. So if that sounds like something that you want to be a part of, don't wait. Just click the link in the description or show notes to join, and we'll see you inside.
Hello, everyone. This week I had a beautiful email, actually. I mean, the sort of thing that encourages people like me, would encourage anyone if it happened to them. A lovely couple that I met many years ago sent me an email, a very kind and affirming email. But the key point was we couldn't help remembering you as we watch what's happening in America, because 25 years ago in Oxford, we heard you talk about the relationship between loyalty and truth. And you pointed out that the ordering of virtues is not part of our world anymore at the moment. And that's a disaster because they're not all equal. So what's happening with the Somalis in Minnesota is typical of immigrant groups. You've lost everything. You're looking for some sort of structure in your lives, and if you meet someone from your own background and you can get some more to come and join you, your loyalty to that group is huge. And when you come from a tribal environment like Somalia, read The Desert Sands by Thesiger if you want to know more about that. This is even more real. So what we're seeing in the immigrant groups that are doing fraud on a big scale in Minnesota is the natural outworking of getting the virtues in the wrong order. If loyalty to a group comes first, then Islam, for instance, teaches that lying to an infidel for the good of Islam is the right thing to do, because loyalty to Islam is above all other things. Now, Jesus, of course, said, "I am the truth, the way, and the life." So if he's top of your life, then truth should be, with a big T, is a major factor. And I'll say more about that later on in today's video. But I just wanted to begin by encouraging you to talk to your friends about the relationship between loyalty and truth. And you can immediately see its application to what's happening around the world. In Britain, the Pakistanis are totally loyal to other Pakistanis and will not in any way attack them, even when they're raping girls on an industrial scale. When you look at Minnesota, it's pretty clear that the Somalis had a very organized exploitation of government money fraudulently. It's pretty clear that they're selling, marketing on a global scale with others, large amounts of drugs. I gather 4 students have died in the University of Minnesota from drug overdose this year already. And they won't criticize it because it's bringing in so much money. So loyalty to the group is paramount. And this, of course, is what gangs are. Gangs put group loyalty over any questions of truth, meaning, goodness, virtue, duty. So spend some time talking to your friends about whether we are as committed to truth as our grandparents were. I know, imprinted on my backside when I was quite small, I learnt that in this family, lying is in no way acceptable. And I am so grateful for that. So, truth and loyalty, which is dominant in your life, in your church, in your family, in your local communities, And is it out of hand in America and Britain? Yes, it is. That's clear. This little bit will be chopped off and used separately. But if there's anyone joining this podcast who hasn't been here before, welcome. You're part of a process which is certainly utterly unexpected by me. I thought I should be retiring into the final phases of my life. I'm only, just over a month away from my 86th birthday. But that's not the case. I'm being stimulated every week by Craig, who makes this podcast happen, but by others as well. I belong to a couple of groups within the context of the church that I enjoy greatly. The conversations are encouraging and helpful. So I hope you all have similar relationships. I mean, we need to find new ways to do this, because the way communities were held together, particularly church communities, when I was growing up, was by the women. And the reason was very straightforward. In the 1950s, when I was 10 and onwards, women were not allowed to have a full-time job if they had children. So they could have part-time jobs, but that's all. And that meant that there were women interacting all the while. They were the eyes and ears and the gossip of the community. And the same applied to the church. The women's meeting was one of the biggest meetings in the church, and now it doesn't exist. And simply giving it a new name for whatever church, and pretending it could be done by an administrator, that's nonsense. It's got to have some sort of organic basis in relationships that can't be foisted on it by some bureaucratic hierarchy telling them how to do it when they have no idea who the people are. My mother and her best friend in the church ran the women's group every Thursday forever. And the women turned out in goodly numbers. In fact, they took a 50-seater bus twice a year, trip to the seaside or somewhere else, and have tea while we were there, and then come back again. It was just a day out, a different day. But every week they had a meeting where the Bible was central. And as I've said on this podcast earlier, my mother also taught Sunday school to 30 plus kids on her own for over 30 years. And God blessed her by having the last letter she understood before she disappeared into Alzheimer's was from a young woman who many years later had come to faith in Canada and realized when it happened that everything had been prepared by the fact that my mother had taught her all the stories in the Bible. Those organic sort of communities, they go on. The first reading group I started inadvertently was just talking to a lovely doctor from Bloemfontein with whom we've stayed many times. And she loved literature, and she found what I had to say about books helpful. So I said, why don't you start a reading group? And she did, and it's been running for 25 years. Here, the reasons for the group are not so much family, but post-family. Not entirely, but particularly in a community like the Afrikaner community in South Africa, very traditional. The man has the job and earns the money, and the woman facilitates everything that needs to be done around that. And then the guy retires, and the women have time on their hands. So if there's a women's reading group, it doesn't need to be women's, but women and men are different at this level. That's not to say that both sexes can't get together on this issue, but there is a significant difference between a men's group and a women's group. But once they get going and they get introduced to books of higher quality, it's amazing what happens. The Elizabeth Googe bit that I read last week would be, she would be a wonderful author to use for a women's group. Getting books going at the moment, though, in North America is not easy because it's blatantly obvious that most people, even within the church, are not reading. So we really need to start thinking about that. Now, I got to go on now to read to you a poem. And don't turn off immediately, please, as most people don't do poetry anymore. But I know that the majority of the people listening are Christian, and those who are not against Christianity. And this is a poet I've only just come across, providentially, I think. And he's written a whole series of sonnets on the I am statements in the New Testament. And this one is, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And his name is Malcolm Guite, Guite. And it's just a classic sonnet. Wherever someone knows that they are lost and cries for help to God to find their way. Sorry, I'm going to start again. Wherever someone knows that they are lost and cries for help to find the way back home, and turns toward their Father's house at last, you are their way before they know your name. Wherever someone searches for the truth and tests each answer in its turn, stressing the question, pressing to the pith, you are the truth they cannot yet discern. Wherever someone sorrows over death, yet seems to glimpse a gate beyond the grave, a living spirit in the dying breath, you are the life within the life they love. You came to us before we asked to pray, till you become our life, our truth, our way. Wonderful to see someone take that very, very well-known verse and expand it for us. And he's quite a well-known modern poet, and somehow I had missed him, but that has now been corrected. I have quite a lot to read. I also want to read something else to you. In the world it is called tolerance, but in hell it is called despair. The sin that believes in nothing, cares for nothing, enjoys nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing and remains alive because there is nothing for which it will die. That's Dorothy Sayers on tolerance, despair. And we live in a despairing society, looking at the astronomical amounts of drugs that are being pushed around the world and sold at vast profits. But they're only sold because we humans have got to that level of degradation where we no longer enjoy the life of the mind, so we switch it off because it's too much to cope with. And this has all happened in my lifetime. I will never forget the first drug addict I saw. I was in my mid-20s, doing internal medicine. And I was a resident. And he came in. I can't remember what he came in with, some sort of infection, but that wasn't the point. A little while before, his girlfriend, they were out one night in London, and she said, "Oh, you're very dull tonight. Let me get you something to make you more exciting." And she mainlined him heroin, and he was totally vulnerable. She destroyed him in that one moment. Horrendous, absolutely horrendous. The bottom layer of society, which used to get drunk, which takes a little while and gives you a headache the next day but doesn't make you incompetent, used to be the escape route, and that was bad enough. And we knew then that prohibition of alcohol was a disaster and that it had introduced the mafia into America. If you ban something that people really want, instead of helping them to use it properly, if there is a proper way, you increase criminality. It's inevitable. You can't legislate goodness. So that was the first addict I saw. And now, well, I don't know what the official figures are these days, but they're huge. And the numbers that die per year, I saw a statistic, whether it's one of these fake things or real, I don't know, but I can believe it's probably real, that more people have died in the last, what should we say, 25 years from drugs than have died in war. That's where we've got to. And in our churches, we don't talk about it, do we? Except dismissively, that's not us almost, is a way, holier than thou. That's not the way to go. But they're not easy to deal with, I know that. You all know that. But we need to do something about it. And if we're going to care for them, we don't do that by having safe injections, do we? That we know that doesn't work now, and the neighbourhood where it is placed immediately becomes extremely dangerous, especially for children. No, we shouldn't do that. Safe injection sites, you may be able to rig the statistics to show some benefits to the drug addicts, but you've got to put the collateral damage in. The best approach I ever saw to it, but I mean, it was a long while ago, and you probably couldn't do that. You'd have some liberal somewhere arguing about it, but people were running a place where people who were passed out on the street could be dropped off, and basically it was dry and warm. It was under the arches of the railway, and I think, if I remember rightly, there was straw on the ground, and in the morning when people came round and they went about their lives, they simply swept the whole lot out and dried it up, cleaned it, and ready for another load the next night. But at least they were warm, dry, and out of range of nastinesses of the physical variety. But in the long run, there's got to be places where they can go to get dried out. And it's in our interest that we do not have intoxicated people around our children. And the society has a right to say, no, you can't do that here. We will provide a place for you in the country where you will have food, you'll have warmth, you'll have facilities, and what help we can give you to get off the drugs. But you cannot leave intoxicated. Yes, it's like a prison, but it's not a prison. It's just a containment area while you get your act together. And if you don't get your act together, you'll stay there. I mean, we closed down all the long-term stay for people with mental illness and everything else. Wasn't a good idea. Given the amount of money we spend on weapons, we could easily have kept them going under a special budget and not let it contaminate healthcare. Although we always want to medicalize our behavior. Not a good idea. So something like that, I think, needs to be done. You can't allow your cities to be destroyed by people camping on the streets, no matter how liberal you are. Because you've got something wrong when it destroys beautiful, functional communities and replaces them with everybody having put cameras on their doors and 3 locks on their doors. That's not an improvement. So, time to step back and say, what was the difference? Well, it was legitimate intolerance, which is what Dorothy Sayers was talking about there. The 10 Commandments are the 10 divine intolerances, and God says if you keep them, if you allow those intolerances to form your character, if you insist on it for your children in particular, Deuteronomy 6, then you will flourish. It has to be faced. I mean, we're in such denial at the moment that the arts faculty of the university is teaching the students propaganda. That everything the West did is evil colonialism. They don't even bother to check the facts. The biggest slaves market in the world at the moment is Africa. There are more slaves in Africa today than ever crossed the Atlantic, and the ones that did, their offspring, are much better off than the ones who actually stayed behind. I think the book was called Black Like Me, that a black guy from Canada looking for his roots. I think it was in Benin, but I'd have to check that. You can check it quite easily. But he has now admitted that the story he wrote there was brushed up so that people could feel that the problem was not theirs. They hadn't done it. It was done to them. It was the victim status, but it's not true. I think it was Benin, but certainly one country in that little bit of West Africa basically ran its whole economy on slavery. And you want me to student who knows that? They also don't know that the Muslims took many more slaves than anyone else. And the first thing they did was to castrate them, which is why they don't have a racial problem amongst the Muslims in the same way. They made sure that anybody coming from a distinctly, visibly different community couldn't reproduce. Astonishing. They don't know that. When I asked them, where was the first place where there was a serious political attack on slavery, and what was the date? They don't know it. It's actually the 12th century. And Wikipedia won't take you there because it's so out of line with the liberal elite's idea of what the narrative should be. Because it was Anselm's, almost his last activity before he died, when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Church in England, in the 12th century. You put up Anselm, 12th century bishops' conference, and he said there to the bishops, slavery is clearly wrong. We must teach that, and we must get it out of England. And they did, because in those days, even the king feared excommunication. Now the king fears no one and nothing, so he's not controllable in the way that he used to be. So slavery disappeared from England in the 12th century. Of course, the slave traders, they just simply moved to Ireland. Holland was very close behind in terms of their attitude to slavery because they could see. Paul had destroyed it intellectually in the first century, but it took a dozen centuries to get there. That needs to be thought about too. The things we want, we look upon them as though they could be done by fiat. I mean, I'm sure that Saudi Arabia has spent billions of dollars on its young people to get them educated, and yet there's no inventiveness streak there, and they have one of the highest unemployment rates, the young men. I think it's around 30% or close to it in one of the richest countries in the world. There isn't a technical solution to this problem. Whatever solution comes up has to fit in with how human nature is made. Now I'm going to read to you again. I really do hope that you get this habit of when you hear something said well, write it down by hand so that you know what it's about, that you don't get lost again. And what I'm looking for, it should be relatively recent. Yes. This is written by Strabo, who died in 849. And he's writing about the impact that Charlemagne had on Europe. Now, there aren't many dates that are really worth remembering, but I write it 732, the Battle of Tours. The Muslims had grown from their stop in Arabia, so they stretched from what is now Pakistan and were into Europe, halfway into France, when they were thoroughly beaten by not Charlemagne, but his grandfather, And they understood it as a miracle from God. And this is what Strabo writes about Charlemagne. He says Charlemagne was able to offer the cultureless, and I might say almost completely unenlightened realm which God had entrusted to him, a new enthusiasm for knowledge. In its earliest state of barbarousness, his kingdom had been hardly touched at all by any such zeal. But now it opens its eyes to God's illumination. In our own time, the thirst for knowledge is disappearing again. The light of wisdom is less sought after and is now becoming rare again in most men's minds. We have these moments when things get better, but it's not an accident that it took 1,000 years of Christian influence before anything dramatic happened. And it happened only where that influence occurs. I spent a lot of time in Africa and talking to lovely Christian men who love the Bible and love church. I mean, their Sunday morning service lasts 3 hours in the area I know and love. But there's no teaching. And eventually it got to me, and I had been, I think, providentially introduced to the importance of Deuteronomy by Bruce Walkie. And I started teaching Deuteronomy to young men who wanted their world to improve. Because the question the church asks in Africa is, why aren't we developing? And they're not. I could take you to dozens of mission hospitals which provided a service for 50 years perhaps in some cases, and were then handed over to the local community, and in 10 years they're gone. Now, the reason is that they don't have the virtues developed and ordered in the way that is necessary. There's no question that in Nigeria, the Anglican bishops would love to be able to take over the whole of teaching again, because Christians did teaching better because we had a motivation to do it. But the great Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century said this: there are some who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge, that is curiosity. There are very few of those people. They are the real scientists of the past. They don't destroy my circles, said Archimedes, the man, the Roman, I guess it was. I don't know who it was, but the soldier was about to kill him. He really was interested in learning. And you meet these people, the professor who was the most academic professor that I ever encountered personally in my training, Anthony Dornhorst at St. George's, his sitting room at home, I never went there, but those who did said, well, they always had a good fire going and 2 deck chairs. His wife was equally an academic, and books, and that was it, He could also play the flute at concert class, so he wasn't, and teach biomedical engineers and argue with them about thermodynamics. He was a polymath, but he had a profound influence on me. I don't think he was a believer at any stage, but I hope he became one. I don't know. He's dead now. But those kinds of people are so important and now, of course, with wokeness dominant in the university, the inevitable outcome is a diminution in competence. As Jordan Peterson never tires of pointing out, that Men and women have similar overarching IQs, everything else, and it's normally distributed in most cases. But we don't think about it. I mean, he's good at the way he does this. Years and years ago, I had a course in biochemistry, which basically committed to teaching students how to criticize the literature. And the only prerequisite was that you must have done a course in statistics. And then I would begin the class by drawing a normal distribution curve and asking them, putting the lines in that all of you should know, and asking them what those lines meant. They didn't know. They couldn't remember. They didn't know what they meant. They might be able to say, well, that's a standard deviation. They never remembered standard error. Although just by manipulating and doing good statistics, major progress was made in the treatment of leukemia simply by applied statistics without any significant new drugs in a long while. Randomized controlled trials properly done. But they had no idea about what it meant. And I had to point out to them that there is a difference between the male and female curves. The idiots in the class are highly likely to be men because the real idiots, the tail at the bottom end, is the curve for men just stretches further. The women have a tighter curve. But on the other end, the genii are much more likely to be men for the same reason. The curves are different. What the biological cause of that is, I don't know. But that it is there, and we ought to think about it, because we actually need those extremely bright people, and they need cosseting because they're not normal by definition. The old university was a place where they could be themselves, and some of them never did anything of any importance because they obsessed over something that had no practical significance. But you take many of the universities, and as long as we kept university entrance down to less than 5% of the population, those extremely bright people were all in that category. They could all go. I mean, I went to university from a school in Birmingham, one of the best in the country, where Tolkien had been a generation before me, also one of the best generals in the Second World War, Slim, who managed the Burma campaign. There were once 3 future archbishops of Canterbury in the same class at that school, because it was highly competitive. So 6 million people to choose from, 100 boys a year. Everybody went there, had the IQ that would take them to university unless something went wrong or they had better things to do. But the moment you start saying, we can't have those differences, we must get rid of them, you can't get rid of them. They're biological. You wouldn't dream of saying we have to have 90-pound weaklings playing rugby. They'd get murdered, first of all. No, in sports, we're still perfectly rational. We want the best there is. But in university, we're not doing that anymore. And once you dilute it down, then the teacher has to start lowering standards. This is crazy. We are all given gifts to which we have no right. And within the Judeo-Christian story, what those gifts give us is duty, responsibility. We are pure individualism is not acceptable. It will not produce societies that function. So we need to start talking about this. Now, in practice, of course, home and Christian schools are getting round this. If you grow up in an environment like, say, there are 3 families in Cambridge when I was an early researcher, and it was astonishing for me to realize that if those families got together for Christmas, there would be at least 4 Nobel Prize winners at Christmas dinner. Now that's got to make a difference to kids, doesn't it? We do need, just as we have a duty to look after children who are handicapped in any way, because they're important too. They teach us empathy. They can shake us up to make us think that could be me. Unfortunately, the gift they seem to have is they don't complain a lot in most cases, and so they set us an example. But at the other end too, you don't want to dilute the top end because you want it to be highly productive. Now, in sport, Formula One racing is actually populated by extremely intelligent people. The average IQ of a Formula One driver is in the order of 160. They're off the charts. So the church leadership is the only way around this, because church leadership in 1 Timothy 3 is about character. You hire skill, but you need character to lead if you're going to be a moral and functional society. Now, I was going to talk about one thing. I have to mention it. I mean, virtually every Christmas, when there's a lot of noise going on, I will pick up one of the volumes of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and enjoy reading it again. And one of the lines that came up this year as I was making my annual dip, homage into Tolkien, was where I think it was Legolas and Gimli talking about that. Certainly it was the non-Hobbit characters saying, looking at the hobbits and say man in their terms, that includes Aragorn as well. And they say, they're strange. Men often fail of their promise, but never of their seed. And that's true. We all fail to develop the gifts we've been given as well as we could. But thank God, there are always people who do, and they're very important to the ethos of a society. You know, we've lost this in politics at the moment. We have a dreadful lack of real character at the top, ethical character. That needs to change. There's a real failure to understand that cultures are different, and if we want some things, only certain cultures have shown the ability to do them. This silly multicultural nonsense. The only cultures in the world that gave us development in science and in other areas was the Judeo-Christian West. You know, Hinduism produced a meditative society, which is extraordinary in many ways, but it wasn't productive in that way. Similarly with China. In fact, if you read Neil Ferguson's account of how the elite in China, who were very intelligent but didn't know how to do things, how they destroyed China. I can never remember whether it's in Civilization, I think. But read the book. Give you something to think about. History matters. When the Jews forgot their history, and their history was forgotten by the Egyptians, Moses was forgotten and the Jews became slaves. Is that what you want? You've got to start talking about what has happened to you and where you learnt what you have learned, which is gift about character. I have watched this Christmas time 3 videos by John Lennox, which I highly recommend. You can just put John Lennox talking about Daniel to Norwegian students, and it will come up. Absolutely brilliant and very, very apposite to our time. And the other thing, as I started with my recognition of how we get these things wrong was really given a shake by this issue of First Things from 2020, and I go back to it every now and again. It's called The Suicide of the Liberals by Gary Saul Mawson. That's First Things, October 2020. You can just go firstthings.com and find it that way. I thoroughly recommend it. I had no idea. We're mirroring at the moment. In the early part of the 20th century, the educated people in Russia fell for victim status and started making a icon out of the people who ultimately became the Marxists. And what Mawson does is give you an account of the way the liberal elite supported minority, underprivileged victims. And ultimately, Lenin said, they will buy the ropes and we will hang them. And that's what they did. We've tried the left-wing Marxist approach to government in at least 25 different places. It hasn't worked in any of them. We need to know enough to be able to talk about it, and to find ways to talk about it that aren't necessarily in your face, just simply asking questions. John Lennox does it superbly. But the key questions that have got to be asked all the while are, how do you explain that there's something rather than nothing? Where did we come from? What are we here for? We all feel it. We all know that we find satisfaction in saying, I was made for this. Where am I going? We all have, as in that poem I read at the beginning, a sense that this is not all there is. And then you get the practicalities: death, suffering, justice. You've got to have a means of talking about them. And that leads you to the practicalities. What can I know with certainty, different degrees? Therefore, what ought I to believe? Your beliefs ought to be rational. Christian belief is rational. And anybody who says it's not is simply cheating by having a definition of rationality that doesn't allow them to get off the ground. So, some things you ought to believe, and out of those you can derive ethics. But ethics without God is not possible. If there is no God, says Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov, then everything is permissible. We don't want that world, do we? Go and think and talk and challenge in this new year.